All right. So the U.S. is becoming a transcontinental power with all that new land that they received from the British. And then the French, 1803, the Louisiana Purchase under Jefferson's administration, adding new states. As they're continuing to expand, the regions in the United States are taking on unique forms of identification in regards to their economy, their workforce. For example, the Midwest, which would include states like Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, they are known as large-scale commercial agricultural operations, known for those large-scale big farms, where they produce crops like corn and wheat especially, and then livestock such as cattle and hogs. So that is the Midwest marker or identification, large-scale farms, commercial agriculture. In the South, it is what? It was tobacco, but now it is cotton. As that great American institution sings about, that group called Alabama, we were walking in tall cotton. So cotton explodes in the South. Y'all know about Alabama, the music group. Are they still relevant today in country music? Y'all haven't heard of Alabama? Play me some music. I feel old. Okay. And as cotton, as cotton crops, plantations grew, what was needed to sustain that? Slaves, right. So the institution of slavery continued to grow. Cotton was a very labor-intensive crop, and so as plantations grew, they needed more and more slaves. More and more laws were passed. For example, a law was passed that if a slave was a runaway slave, it was illegal to help them obtain their freedom. You had to return them back to their master. So as cotton grew, and again, it brought in a lot of money, and money is what makes the world go round. The slave labor grew, and that was protected. In the Northeast, they were characterized as an industrial region. You had mills and factories and banks really starting to dot the landscape in the Northeast. So these are the workforce characteristics of these regions as the Union begins to expand westward. As immigrants continue to come into the country during the Revolutionary War, and then for the first couple of decades after that, immigration had slowed down drastically. But in this first half of the 19th century, it picks back up. So by 1850, the United States had the fastest growing economy on the planet. Now, not the largest, not the most powerful economic nation just yet. That was still Britain, but their economy, the United States economy, was growing rapidly. And we're going to now look at the factors of why that happened. We want to talk about, first of all, or any questions on those summation points before we get into the details. So we're going to look at a revolution in the market, the economic market in the United States. Now here's a little tie-in back to some of the earlier chapter material that we didn't get to. George Washington, our first president, he picked a man by the name of Alexander Hamilton to be his Secretary of the Treasury. He also picked a gentleman by the name of Thomas Jefferson to be his Secretary of State. Alexander Hamilton had a vision for the nation in which basically the central government would grow in its power and influence, and state power would decrease, and there would be a federal banking system. Hamilton envisioned more and more professions and industries coming into the nation. And so he envisioned the United States becoming an industrial nation. Thomas Jefferson and others like James Madison, they wanted the United States to stay as an agrarian, agricultural society. Small communities with small farms. And so Hamilton and Jefferson really were enemies within Washington's cabinet. And Jefferson stepped down as Secretary of State after a few years, and Hamilton's vision really was the one that stuck for the most part. The first Bank of the United States was founded, I believe that was 1792, and they had a 20-year charter. And so as we talk about a market revolution in the first half of the 19th century, we're really seeing Hamilton's vision start to really blossom in the United States. The thing that spurred this revolution was the large-scale commercial agricultural farms. And plantations where cotton was grown in the South. And so a first key component to the market revolution was the innovation in transportation during this first half of the century. Before the 19th century, transportation was very slow, very expensive. Horseback riding, maybe some wagon coaches, stage coaches, but roads were not very good at that time. During the first half of the 19th century, there were several innovations that helped to improve transportation, make it cheaper, and to also speed it up. And also offer better quality transportation. One of the things was new roads. Roads that were used by stagecoaches, also used by these large horse-drawn wagons called Conestogas. This made travel much more convenient for those who traveled in this way. Now I'm going to bring up some slides. So you can see the progress here of roads being the orange color from 1830, roads moving westward. And then in 1840, they're starting to go north-south or in diagonal directions, connecting some of these big east-west roads, more interconnections, and then you can see the roads are staying about the same as canals and railroads increase. So by 1821, you had 4,000 miles of turnpike in the United States. Not like Turner Turnpike or Muskogee Turnpike here in Oklahoma, but much better quality roads that were much more convenient for carriages, horseback riders, these Conestogas to be able to navigate. And these roads would have been used probably primarily for westward expansion. Families and primarily men moving westward to acquire land and begin a homestead where they could farm. Another innovation was transportation in waterways, as well as vehicles of transportation on the water. For example, you had the steamboat. Built by Robert Fulton in 1807. You also had flatboats, which could haul cargo down rivers like the Mississippi, down the Hudson River to New York Harbor. So that was very important in transporting goods, manufactured goods, agricultural goods. You had canals being built. And you can see the canals that were added from 1830 to 1860. One of the most important canals being the Erie Canal that connected the Hudson River with the Chesapeake Bay area. And that basically ran through the middle of New York State. By 1837, there were 3,000 miles of canal waterways in the United States. But one of the things about the canals, one of the consequences of it was there was an economic consequence of it tied together the Midwest and Eastern economies. And in consequence of that, it isolated the South. So you're starting to see a division in the northern part of the Union. And remember, that included at that time what was known as the Midwest from the southern part. The southern part is where cotton is king and the labor is slave driven. Up here in the north and the Midwest, people are able to work on farms, in industries, in trades, and factories, and are able to support themselves, make a living, build a life. So two type of cultures are starting to form, and the canal system had a part in that. So it was not only an economic consequence, there was a political consequence. Also, another innovation in water transportation was on the ocean. You had ships called clipper ships, which could travel quicker than merchant ships. And they could do this because they had taller masts and they had more sails. And so they could transport goods a lot quicker. This lasted, though, until after the Civil War. So those are the innovations in H2O transport. Questions? So we've talked about more and better roads, an increase in ways to transport on the water. And that was very important, especially with us now having control of the Mississippi River. But there was another mode of transportation that was the most influential during this time. What would that be? Anybody seen the new Lone Ranger with Johnny Depp? And
is it railroads?
Railroads, yeah. Railroads expanding that westward migration, or facilitating that westward migration. For example, in 1830, you had 23 miles of railroad. In 20 years' time, 30,626 miles of railway. So railroads were a great innovation that was probably the greatest catalyst for westward expansion, as well as the growth of a market revolution in the United States. And this is why it was so much greater. Number one, you could carry a lot more people on a railroad, on a train, than you could on a stagecoach. And you could also carry a lot more freight, goods, crops, lumber, material, things like that. Another advantage to railroads was think about the Erie Canal and the Hudson River in December and January. What would be a reoccurring issue with those bodies of water? Anybody been up north during the winter months? I mean, the last time I walked on water was when I was visiting my mom in Connecticut. The lake was completely frozen. I walked on the water. So what do you think happened with the Hudson River and the Erie Canal during those winter months? Sometimes they froze over. It would be hard for barges and steamboats to go down them. But with a train, you could operate year-round. You have a bad snowstorm in the north, the roads are covered up, you can't travel down by horse or stage or coach. So the railroads could go year-round, and it was a really great innovation. A third thing about them was they were faster. They were cheaper, and they went farther than those other modes of transportation. And then another great advantage to the railroads was they connected local markets, right? Philadelphia's market could be connected much more efficiently with New York's market. And then small towns in Pennsylvania, where there's small farmers, could be connected to Philadelphia much more easily. And this connection of local markets, smaller ones with larger ones, helped change the U.S. economy from a economy that was made up of small markets that were sparsely connected to the emergence of a national marketplace where connections were really very fluid because of the railroads. Let's look at the railroad figure here. So 1830, somewhere there was 23 miles of railroad. Maybe up there somewhere. By 1850, there's 30,000 plus miles. And then another 10 years later, you can see even the more railroad mileage. Whereas in 1850, there was not much past the Mississippi River. Here, there's a lot more across the mighty Mississippi. So these, this picture with these roads and canals and railroads that look like arteries, that's a good illustration of how the nation from this point, 1830 to here, has become more interconnected. And it's a national economy in the true sense of the word national, as opposed to smaller local economies that have basically just a small influence. Very similar to politically under the Articles of Confederation, you know, all the states were equal, including the small states. And then under the Constitution, federalism is more prominent, and the central government, the central federal government, continues to grow. So you have a similar phenomenon economically. in about 25 years from 1860, you will have yet another breakthrough form of transportation when Doc comes back to 1885 in his time machine to get things right that Marty messed up in Back to the Future. Tell me you've seen Back to the Future.
Yes, movie. I love that show.
Okay, all right. All right, with that, we'll take a break. We'll go till 10:17, 6 minutes. All right, we're going to move on to a second major component of the market revolution, and that is improved communications. Along with transportation, communication in the New World improved greatly during this time. So if we just think back to, a generation, 40 years to around the time of the revolution, what was a way to communicate? And what's the famous way that we think of that the news that the British were invading was communicated?
Mail.
Mail, okay. I'm thinking of the famous
word of mouth.
The famous thing, and Andy Griffith just talked about it for us on that clip of the show. When the British were coming.
Lanterns.
There were lanterns involved.
Paul Revere?
Paul Revere riding on horseback, riding from village to village, telling everybody. But yeah, there were lanterns. There were also newspapers. There was a postal system, but not quite that extensive. But communication was pretty slow. For example, when Washington died around the latter part of the 18th century, George Washington, it took a week. He died in Virginia. It took a week for the news to get to New York City. that excuse me, that amount of time was greatly reduced with these new types of communications. The first one is similar to Paul Revere riding a horse, but you had basically a relay system where instead of one horse riding 100 and 150 miles, making the whole trip, a rider would go 30 or 40 miles and then get on a new, fresh horse. So relay horse riders helped communication speed up. The aforementioned postal service. In 1790, there were 75 post offices. By 1860, there were 28,500 post offices.
Who's computer smart in here?
What's that?
I was hunting somebody smart with computers,
Oh, okay.
but nobody stepped up. I'm leaving.
I feel like anybody who's a millennial is smart with a computer. They're just being modest.
He's gone already.
Hey, Terry, excuse me, guys. Charlotte's calling my phone. I've already answered it. Okay, sorry about that, guys. So the Postal Service. Wouldn't it be cool if they could really train some owls like in Harry Potter to deliver your mail? That would be awesome. Another improvement in communications. The advancement in the printing press. And what that did was, as the technology got better, they could reduce the costs of newspapers, and more people, I think, for example, the textbook mentions papers that were 6 cents a copy dropped to a penny. So more people could buy papers and be informed. Just as railroads were the most influential form of transportation, the most influential form of communication during this time was the telegraph system, invented by Samuel Morse. And they could transfer messages electromagnetically almost instantaneously. So great strides in communication. This helped with the market revolution. Technological advances in transportation and in communications. Questions? All right, we're going to get into third gear here and try to finish up this stuff. We're going to talk about the industrial development in the United States during this time, which we would call the early industrial revolution. So over the course of the next few weeks, we're going to go through these 4 stages of the Industrial Revolution, and we want to we're going to stay within this first period in which the introduction of mechanical production facilities, also with the help of water and steam power, helped bring about the early Industrial Revolution. Steam engine invented in 1769. We can already see the application of that with the steamboat invented in 1807. Also, the connection with railroads, the interrelation with canals, the telegraph in 1837, submarine telegraph in 1851. This helps the world to become smaller, and these are keys to the early Industrial Revolution. Other factors that we need to understand are more people living in the large cities of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New Orleans. You had a growing urban culture or society. What Thomas Jefferson feared was happening. America was moving away from an agrarian culture to an industrial one. So more people in the bigger cities, the transportation and communication improvements, and then what we want to focus on now is the ability to produce more goods more crops. Mass production is what we're looking at here. And new technology helped with this mass production. Some of the new American tech at the time was vulcanized rubber produced by a man named Charles Goodyear in 1844. Of course, it wasn't for tires yet on a vehicle, but it was used for things like hoses, seals. This vulcanized rubber was much more durable, much more flexible. So that was one of the innovations that helped. A man by the name of Elias Howe in 1846 invented the sewing machine. You already had innovations like this, the spinning jenny, which was patented in 1770, which helped with the mass production of weaved material. A great innovation that I know we're very glad for today was the invention and implementation of sewer systems. Help keep those cities a little bit cleaner, more sanitary. Have you guys seen the movie Hoosiers? Basketball movie.
Yes,
Came out in the 80s. Gene Hackman was the coach. Took a little Indiana town to the state championship. You haven't seen Hoosiers?
yes, we have.
Okay. I think it's like one of the top 5 sports movies of all time. Anyway, remember Ollie, the little short guy who couldn't dribble? He was the guy that the coach would not put in unless he had to. Anyway, Coach, whatever Gene Hackman's name was, he was a history teacher. Surprise, right? Basketball coach. And he had his class giving a report, and Ollie was giving a report on inventions that he was glad for. This is to be the 1950s. And the last thing he said was, and indoor plumbing. Praise the Lord for indoor plumbing. No more outhouses, right? Anyway, this ties into the sewer system that I was just mentioning. Okay. And then, of course, we want to remember the cotton gin. A major innovation. A good day's work for a laborer in the cotton field, a good day's work might produce 1 pound of cotton. We're talking over 12 hours of picking. So Eli Whitney invents in 1793 his cotton gin, which would put the cotton with seeds in it here. And I guess you turn that crank and it goes through here to remove the seeds, and then brushes, and then comes out with clean cotton. The introduction to the cotton gin was so revolutionary because they could produce 50 times more cotton in a day. So you have one laborer using this cotton gin could produce 50 pounds instead of 1 pound in a day. And that was a great benefit to the cotton farmers in the South. American cotton became the standard for cotton in Europe, and their business just flourished. Cotton became the largest U.S. export during this time. It was the primary driver in the U.S. economy. And even though it was this major cash cow, it still had that enigma that to produce a lot of it and make a lot of money for the cotton farmers who wanted to experience the American dream, the enigma was they had to enslave other human beings, and they had to employ more of them to produce more cotton and make more money. Cotton was king during this time, sometimes referred to as white gold. So the cotton gin, an important American technological advancement. That really helped in the industrial development of America. Another thing that helped, and this is in the Midwest region where those large farms were, there was a lot of good fertile farmland in these areas, and so a lot of people migrated west from New England and Virginia. And the American technology that came out during this time that helped with the farming was plows, which were made out of iron and steel. Before that, they were made out of wood. But iron plows and steel plows were much more efficient in tilling up the ground. The invention of mechanical seeders, S-E-E-D-E-R-S, seeders, helped farmers to be able to plant much more crops a lot faster than planting them by hand. And then a man by the name of McCormick came up with a mechanical reaper, which, similar to the cotton gin, helped them reap their crops at a much faster rate, in which meant more crops being reaped. And so as farmers begin to have more of a surplus, they don't have to keep all of their crops to themselves. They can start selling it. They can take it down to the railroad station and ship it to markets across the country. And so farm products became an industry in themselves. Another development that helped with this early industrial revolution was the early manufacturing of textiles. That would be thread, other cloths, the production of clothing. Textile factories were set up, and you had a whole factory system crop up in the Northeast. With the advent of these factories and the technological developments like a sewing machine or the spinning jenny, you would have the production of more of these textiles. An interesting thing that our textbook mentions is that as American textiles increased, it started to be a threat to Britain's textile industry. And so Britain would import more of their goods and offer them at cheaper prices. And so this led to the American textile workers lobbying the government, and a tariff in 1816 was produced, or was produced by the government to put a tariff on all imports of textiles. But the interesting thing about that is this was basically the first type of lobbying of the government by an industry. Today we hear about all kinds of lobbying organizations that lobby our government for funds, for legislation. So this is kind of where it started a little over 200 years ago. Another interesting aspect of the textile manufacturing situation was what was called the Lowell system, Lowell. And this was in a town in Massachusetts where a man by the name of Lowell built his textile factory, and it was about a 4 to 5 story brick building built by a river. And basically he would hire primarily younger women to come in and do the work of this factory. And he would also provide living quarters. And the Lowell system really was a community of industry. These young women primarily, there were others of course, but they lived in like dormitories. They had house mothers who made sure they didn't go out at night and fraternize with the boys, and made sure they got to sleep and were ready to do their 12 to 13 hours of work each day. They worked 5.5 days each week. And so this Lowell system was a industry community set up. And interestingly, that was set up in 1822. By 1834, just 12 years later, some of the women went on strike because of the conditions and the pay. And so what you're seeing there not just in the textile industry, but it's going to be come into other industries, other professions, and they're going to start forming labor unions. And what we're seeing is we are seeing the application of democratic principles that were so prominent during the revolutionary period in government. You're starting to see the application of those democratic principles in the economic arena. People, laborers, workers are going to start demanding rights. And they're going to want things like shorter work days. They want insurance. They want safer working conditions from their bosses. And so now with America having our government, our politics kind of in place with the Constitution, now as the economic market industrial situation starts to flourish, there is going to be an application of those democratic principles in the workplace. Labor is going to start organizing. Like I said, labor unions. Also, we're going to see a rise in professions. We're going to see more teachers, more lawyers, more doctors, more engineers. With the rise of professions, you're going to see more women in the professional workplace. Now, women will primarily be in those areas such as textiles, like I mentioned, the Lowell system. They will be in nursing. They will be in teaching. But you're seeing more women enter into the workplace. And also you're seeing more of a collective mindset of equal opportunity. Even though it's not all equal, right? African Americans and women are still far under white males. The idea, the worldview of more equal opportunity is beginning to take more and more, take place more and more in the American collective mindset. Very quickly, let me share with you about the immigration that took place in this first half of the 19th century. I said earlier, immigration picked up. Immigrants were coming to America because of the American dream, and also because there was a worldwide financial panic in 1837. During this period, while there were many types of immigrants, there were two dominant nationalities. The first most prominent was the Irish. They primarily came because of the potato famine in Ireland of 1845. Potatoes were the staple in Ireland. I think the textbook mentioned that the American Ireland male would eat 5 pounds of potatoes a day. So there was a great famine, and so that drove many Irish to come to America. The majority of those Irish were poor. They settled in the cities like Boston, and they were very desperate for work. They also brought a strong Roman Catholic influence into that part of the nation. The second largest group was the Germans. Germans came primarily because of a failed German Revolution in 1848. However, they were much different than the Irish. Instead of being primarily poor people, they sent primarily their skilled workers, craftsmen, artisans, tradesmen, and they were mostly Lutheran or Protestants, along with some Roman Catholics and many Jews. And they settled more in the rural areas, especially the areas of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan. As more of these immigrants came in, a branch or a strain of American, and we see this today, a strong strain of nativism cropped up. One example is the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner in 1849. They later became known as the American Party. They pushed for legislation which would exclude immigrants and Roman Catholics from public office. They also wanted to change the waiting period for immigrants to become natural citizens from 5 years to 21 years. So guys, the The immigration battles that we see today are not new. They have been around in our nation for hundreds of years. And so the nativists were very upset with Irish and Germans and others coming over, working for lower wages and not demanding things that the Native Americans thought they should have, like insurance, better working conditions, those types of things. So any questions on all of that before we dismiss? Sorry, I kept you over a couple of minutes. We will see you Thursday morning.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a good day.
You too. Live long and prosper.
Sounds like a plan.
What? That's